There are two types of skeletal muscle tension. Type 1 is an isotonic contraction. Skeletal muscle changes length, resulting in motion. If the muscle tension increases load or resistance, the muscle shortens, and it's called a concentric contraction. If the muscle tension decreases load or resistance, the muscle lengthens, and that's called an eccentric contraction. So there's concentric, moving it in a positive direction, and eccentric, moving it in a negative direction. The key to isotonic contraction is that it involves movement. Secondly is isometric contraction. This is where skeletal muscle develops tension but is prevented from changing length. So there's no movement. So iso means same, metric means measure. Now let's talk about exercise and muscle activity. At peak exertion, muscles lack oxygen. When there's a lack of oxygen, they're unable to create ATP in the mitochondria of the cell. So now they have to rely on glycolysis for ATP. And remember, ATP is energy for the cell. Glucose will be converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate will be converted to lactic acid. When the acid is built up, the pH is lowered, and that can cause muscular pain and cramping. Now we get to muscular fatigue, and what are the results of muscular fatigue? One cause of muscular fatigue is the depletion of metabolic reserves, such as O2, glucose. Secondly, damage to the sarcolemma and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Third is the decreasing pH or increasing lactic acid. What is the result? It can cause muscular exhaustion and pain. Now let's talk about the recovery period. The recovery period is the time required after the exertion for the muscles to return to normal. Oxygen now becomes available and the mitochondria activity will resume. There are three types of skeletal muscle fibers. The first type of fiber is called a fast fiber. They contract very quickly, they have a large diameter, large glycogen reserves, very few mitochondria, they have very strong contractions, but they fatigue very quickly. There are slow fibers, number two. They're slow to contract, slow to fatigue. They have small diameter, they have much more mitochondria. They have a high oxygen supply, and they contain myoglobin. Myoglobin is the red pigment that binds oxygen. And the third and last type of fiber are called intermediate fibers. They're mid-sized, they have low myoglobin, but they have more capillaries than fast fibers, and they're slower to fatigue. Let's go over muscular hypertrophy. Muscular hypertrophy is muscle growth from heavy training. That includes increases in diameter of the muscle fibers, increases in the number of myofibrils, and increases in the mitochondria or glycogen reserves. Muscular atrophy, on the other hand, is a result of a lack of muscular activity. For example, when your hand is in a cast, the muscle gets smaller. So atrophy is a reduction in muscle size, tone, and power. Anaerobic activities, example would be a 50-meter dash or weightlifting, use fast fibers, but they fatigue very quickly with strenuous activity. It can be improved by frequent, brief, intense workouts that result in hypertrophy. They call it HIIT, H-I-I-T, high intensity interval training. Aerobic activities are prolonged activities. They're supported by the mitochondria. They require oxygen and nutrients. They can be improved by repetitive training. That includes improved neural responses and cardiovascular training. Some other facts about skeletal muscle you should be aware of. What you don't use, you lose. Muscle tone indicates a base activity in motor units of the skeletal muscles. Muscles become flaccid when they're inactive for days or weeks. Muscle fibers break down proteins and become smaller and weaker. With prolonged inactivity, fibrous tissue may replace the muscle fibers. Now, let's go over cardiac muscles. First of all, their characteristics of cardiocytes. Unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle cells are smaller, they have a single nucleus, they're aerobic, they're high in myoglobin and mitochondria, and they're involuntary. There are three functions in cardiac muscle tissue. One is called automaticity, contraction without neural stimulation. So the cardiac muscle tissue is actually controlled by pacemaker cells. There is an influence of the nervous system, so they're controlled by the nervous system, and they have extended contraction time, 10 times as long as skeletal muscle. Now let's cover the third and final type of muscle in the human body, smooth muscle. It forms around other tissues. They're involuntary. In the blood vessels, they regulate the blood pressure and blood flow. In the reproductive and glandular systems, they produce movement. In the digestive and urinary systems, they form sphincters and reduce contractions. And in the integumentary system, they create the erector pili muscles and cause goosebumps. Make sure you know this for the midterm exam and for your exam. It's the theory of muscle contraction. The first thing that happens is the action potential reaches the axon of the motor neuron. Secondly, there's a release of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that goes across the neuromuscular junction or synaptic cleft. Third, the acetylcholine binds to the motor end plate. Fourth, an action potential appears in the sarcolemma, which is the cell membrane of the muscle fiber or muscle cell. And finally, number 5, there's a return to the initial state. This slide shows you the motor neuron, the motor end plate, the neuromuscular junction, the muscle fiber, and the myofibrils. Now we're going to begin going over the muscles of the human body and their regions. There are 2 ways we divide the muscle groups, the axial muscles and the appendicular muscles. Axial muscles are related to the axial skeleton and are mostly used for stabilization, where appendicular muscles is the second division, and that's the appendicular skeleton, and it's related to stabilization and movement, and specifically movement of the limbs. Now let's highlight some of the key parts in the head and neck. Make sure you know the orbicularis oculi, the zygomaticus, the orbicularis oris, the temporalis, the occipital, the masseter, and the sternocleidomastoid. And obviously we're going to go over the trapezius next. This is a frontal view of the head and torso and upper limbs. Make sure you know the frontal belly of the occipital frontalis. Make sure you know the sternocleidomastoid. Make sure you know the pectoralis major, the biceps brachii, the triceps brachii, the rectus abdominis, the latissimus dorsi. Don't forget the deltoid, the extensor carpi radialis longus, and the flexor carpi radialis. Now we move on to the muscles of the thigh and the lower legs. Know the rectus femoris, the vastus muscles, the vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, the tibialis anterior. Now let's go to the back of the torso and neck and upper limbs. Make sure you know the trapezius, the deltoid, the infraspinatus, the teres minor, the teres major, the rhomboids, the latissimus dorsi, the triceps brachii, and the extensor carpi longus. Now let's look at the back side of the thigh and the lower leg. Make sure you know the IT band or the iliotibial band, the bicep femoris, semitendinosus, gastrocnemius, the soleus, and the calcaneal tendon. Now we're going to go over some muscular diseases. The first one, what we just want to touch on, is compartment syndromes. This is a condition in which there are increased pressure mainly in the leg, but it can also be in the forearm, arm, thigh, shoulder, and buttocks. It can also result in a loss of a limb in an extreme case. Tendinitis. Remember, anything with an itis means inflammation of. So tendinitis is inflammation of the tendons and of the muscle tendon attachments. Usually they do RICE, rest, and ice. They also do an anti-inflammatory when necessary. Muscular dystrophy. It's actually an umbrella term for a large group of inherited muscle diseases. These muscles are highly damaged or degenerate. The general symptoms are loss of balance or coordination, muscle weakness, and crippling. Here is an image of a person with muscular dystrophy. This would be a very extreme case. And here's another image of another extreme case.